Port Stanley Airfield. Just past 4 in the morning, local time. An Argentine radar operator watches a single contact appear on his screen, 30 miles out and closing fast. He doesn't call for the guns. He calls for confirmation, because what he's looking at should not exist. There's no friendly aircraft scheduled to be in the area. There's no enemy aircraft that could possibly be here either. Argentina is 8,000 miles from the United Kingdom. Every officer on that airfield has done the math, and the math says they're safe. There is no way to fly a heavy bomber that far, drop bombs precisely on target, and bring the crew home again. The aircraft capable of it doesn't exist, except something is already in the air, and it's almost on top of them. To understand why nobody on that airfield saw this coming, you need to understand what Argentina believed the day it seized the islands. Their Air Force had built an entire defense doctrine around one simple fact of geography. The Falklands sat far closer to the Argentine mainland than to anything Britain controlled. Their own fighter jets, flying from bases on the southern coast, had only a handful of minutes of fuel left once they reached the islands, before they had to turn for home. If their best fighters could barely manage the distance one way, what chance did a heavy bomber from Britain have at flying there and back? Britain's aircraft carriers couldn't launch anything that size. Britain had no land base anywhere within striking distance of the islands. The nearest scrap of British territory in that part of the world was a single volcanic island sitting in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from the fighting in either direction. None of that reasoning was wrong. Argentina's planners weren't careless, and they weren't bluffing themselves. What they got wrong was a different question entirely: how far Britain was actually willing to go to prove a point. Because sitting in a hangar back in England was an aircraft nobody expected to fly into combat ever again. A Cold War strategic bomber, originally designed in the 1950s to carry a single nuclear weapon deep into Soviet territory, if the order ever came. By the time Argentina invaded, that aircraft had been quietly demoted for over a decade, shifted away from nuclear duty into conventional roles, and was now just weeks away from permanent retirement. Its last remaining squadrons were already planning farewell ceremonies. The refueling equipment that would have let it fly long distances had been stripped out years earlier, its parts scattered across museum displays, storage yards, and other aircraft entirely. Then, without warning, an order arrived. Get the refueling systems working again, and get this aircraft ready to fly to the other side of the world. What happened over the following days sounds almost too strange to be real. Engineers searched museum exhibits and retired airframes for refueling parts that had been removed and forgotten years earlier. One critical component, reportedly, came off an aircraft sitting on outdoor display overseas. Flight crews who hadn't trained in aerial refueling for years and hadn't dropped a conventional bomb in even longer were given roughly 2 weeks to relearn both skills from nothing. Even the bombing math had to be rebuilt from scratch. Someone had to calculate exactly how many bombs it would take to crater a runway whose construction specifications nobody currently in uniform had ever actually seen, then track down the original building records just to get the numbers right. The answer that came back called for 21 bombs, the most the aircraft could physically carry in a single run. But the bomber wasn't really the hard part. The hard part was distance. No single aircraft, however capable, could carry enough fuel to make a trip that long without help. So the plan that emerged bordered on the absurd. A chain of refueling tankers would form a relay stretching across the ocean. each one pumping fuel forward into the next, then peeling away and turning back for home as its own tanks ran dry. By the time fuel finally reached the bomber for its last refueling before the target, that fuel had already passed through several other aircraft along the way. 11 tankers, all coordinated through the night, all to get one bomber to a single target and back again, in total darkness, in complete radio silence. The first attempt almost ended before it began. The lead bomber developed a pressurization fault shortly after takeoff and had to turn back, handing the mission to the backup crew flying behind it, a crew that had only minutes earlier assumed they were just along for the ride. And even with 11 tankers in support, the plan very nearly fell apart a second time, much further from home. One of the tankers, scheduled to perform the critical final handoff, flew into a storm and damaged its own refueling equipment, leaving it unable to pass fuel the way the plan required. The pilot flying just behind him in the formation had seconds to make an impossible decision. He could keep enough fuel in his own tanks to guarantee getting home safely, or he could give that fuel to the bomber and accept that he might not make it back himself. He chose to give the fuel away. For hours afterward, he and his crew flew north across open ocean with no certainty they would reach land, under strict orders not to break radio silence until the mission below had been confirmed complete. When he finally did call for help, a rescue tanker was scrambled to find him in the dark. They met with only minutes of fuel remaining in his tanks. Meanwhile, far to the south, the bomber dropped low to slip past Argentine radar, climbed back to altitude for its final approach, and released its full bomb load across the runway in a single diagonal pass. Most of those 21 bombs missed their precise mark. One did not. A single direct hit was enough to crater the runway down its center. 3 young Argentine servicemen lost their lives in the attack, the first combat deaths the country's forces suffered in the air war. That crater alone wasn't going to win the war on its own. Argentine engineers had it patched and the runway usable again within roughly a day, and transport flights kept landing there for weeks afterward, simply timed around when the bombers were expected. What changed wasn't the runway. It was something harder to measure and far more important. Within days, Argentina pulled several fighter aircraft back from the front lines to defend its own capital, worried this strike wasn't an isolated stunt, but the opening move of raids that could reach much further inland, toward the mainland itself. Whether that fear was entirely rational is something historians still argue about, and senior British commanders themselves were divided after the war on exactly how much the raid had actually changed. What isn't really in dispute is the message it sent. The distance Argentina had been counting on as a built-in defense had just been proven breakable by a bomber that was supposed to already be sitting in a scrap yard, flown by a crew that had barely 2 weeks to prepare, kept in the air by a relay of aircraft that had to trust each other completely across an entire ocean, at night, in silence. 8,000 miles out, 8,000 miles back, 11 tankers, 1 bomb that actually mattered. That was the message Britain sent that night, and however improbable the method, it landed exactly where it was meant to.